Tonight, the stars above France shimmer faintly, like forgotten memories drifting through time. The bells of ancient cathedrals have long since fallen silent. The corridors of the royal palace are cold and still, and the moonlight creeps gently across old stones as if afraid to disturb the silence. We light a candle now, just one. Its glow dances against the carved stone walls, casting long, trembling shadows that stretch like ghosts across the floor. And in this hush, in this gentle dark, we begin our story. Not a tale of war or glory, not a song of triumph, but a quiet remembrance. A strange and sorrowful chapter in the Book of Kings. A story whispered in dusty libraries and faded letters. A story rarely told and never hurried. It is the story of Charles VI, a king of France, wrapped not in gold and power, but in fragile dreams and ghostly fears. He was crowned in splendor, surrounded by trumpets and velvet robes. But in time, the court grew quiet. The laughter ceased, and the great halls that once echoed with song echoed only with silence, because Charles believed he was made of glass. He would not be touched. He feared breaking. He sat upon his throne with trembling hands and glassy eyes, certain that the slightest brush of a shoulder might shatter him into 1,000 glittering pieces. Some called it madness, others called it enchantment. But no one knew for certain where the king had gone, only that the man who now wandered the palace halls was no longer the boy they once knew. Tonight, we walk softly through those same halls. We trace the candlelit corridors of a mind unraveling. We feel the chill of a throne no longer warm, and listen for the softest of sounds, the faint crack of glass in the silence. You are safe here. The world is far away. Let the night carry you gently and slowly into the folds of a forgotten past. Close your eyes if you wish. Breathe deeply and slowly, and let your thoughts drift like leaves down a still river. We are entering a realm of whispers and dust, of kings and shadows, where time bends and stillness reigns. This is the story of Charles VI of France, the king who thought he was made of glass. The kingdom of France, in the late 14th century, was a land caught between splendor and sorrow. The forests were thick and endless, whispering with the voices of ancient trees. Mist curled over the rivers each morning, like lace drawn by invisible fingers. In the fields beyond the cities, peasants moved slowly under heavy skies, their lives marked by seasons, not hours. The wind carried the scent of burning wood, of wet earth, of the soft decay of fallen leaves. Paris stood at the center, surrounded by high stone walls and twisted alleyways, where crooked chimneys leaned like old men, and windows flickered with orange candlelight. The city murmured at dusk, soft carts rolling over cobblestones, a dog barking in the distance, the quiet sweep of brooms clearing dirt from doorsteps. But even in its busiest hour, it was never loud, never bright. France was always a little dim, a little weary, as though it too were holding its breath. Above it all stood the palace, the Louvre, not yet a museum but a royal stronghold. Its towers touched the sky like stone fingers, its windows staring out over the Seine like watchful eyes. The ceilings arched high, and the floors echoed with every step. Tapestries fluttered when no wind blew. Fires burned low, not for warmth, but for memory. Beyond the capital, the countryside unrolled like a painting. Wide fields dotted with sheep, sleepy villages tucked beneath hills, and ancient cathedrals that seemed to grow from the earth itself. The land was tired from war. The 100 Years' War that came and went in waves, like a storm that could never quite pass. Even the sky seemed uncertain in those years. Sometimes a gray fog would fall for days, muffling sound and color alike. Sometimes the stars refused to show themselves, hiding behind thick clouds as though they, too, were afraid to watch. The royal court was a strange thing in those days. It glittered, yes, velvet gowns and golden goblets, music drifting from behind heavy curtains, but beneath the beauty there was tension, nobles whispered. Courtiers watched each other with guarded eyes. Power passed from hand to hand, uncertain and fragile. The crown itself felt heavier somehow, as though it knew the troubles that lay ahead. France was both grand and trembling, a place where roses bloomed beside broken stones, where monks lit incense beside crumbling statues, where kings walked among ghosts and the past was never far behind. And it was into this world, cold, delicate, and full of waiting, that Charles was born. He would be crowned while still a child, praised while still unsure, adored, yet silently feared. The kingdom around him watched with held breath, wondering what kind of king he would become. They could not yet see the shadows gathering. They could not yet hear the soft crack of glass beneath his crown. But the wind was already changing, the night already deepening. And in the far corners of the land, ravens stirred. For France, and for its fragile king, A strange stillness was about to begin. In the quiet chambers of the royal palace, far from the council halls and the glittering feasts, a child once played beneath stained glass windows and drifting candlelight. Charles was born on a cool December night in the year 1368. The snow had not yet fallen, but the wind outside the thick stone walls whispered of it. The midwives moved quietly, the fire hissed softly, and within the swaddling cloth the newborn prince barely cried. Even then, some said he seemed still. He was the son of King Charles V, a cautious and thoughtful monarch, and Queen Joanna of Bourbon, a woman often described as gentle but remote, like a statue with downcast eyes. The child inherited their calm, their softness, their silences. As a boy, Charles wandered the palace with slow steps, his small hands trailing along the cold stone walls. He loved the quiet, found comfort in it. He rarely laughed, and when he did, it was like a whisper of a bell in the distance, soft, rare, and soon gone. Servants recalled how he would sit for hours at the window, watching the river below, unmoving. He liked the water, the way it shimmered and curled and vanished around corners. Sometimes he would speak to it, in a voice so low the maids weren't sure if he was praying or dreaming. He was not a sickly child, not outwardly. He grew tall, with fine features and eyes the color of pale skies just before rain. But there was something behind those eyes, something not quite anchored, a drifting, a distance. At night, he often refused to sleep in his own bed. He feared mirrors, he feared loud voices, and once, in a fit of trembling, he asked a nursemaid if he would still be real when the moon went away. He had a brother, Louis, and several sisters, but Charles remained apart, loved, yes, but solitary. While the other children played, he lingered in the chapel, tracing patterns in the wax drippings near the altar. He would sometimes wake crying, though he could not say why. And once, he stood at the edge of the great hall for nearly an hour, unmoving, eyes fixed on something no one else could see. Some said the boy was cursed, others said he was simply delicate. But everyone agreed he was a child wrapped in silence. He was taught to ride, to hunt, to speak in matters of court. But these lessons never sat easily with him. He preferred soft things, music in minor chords, pages of illuminated books, and the sound of snow falling against the leaded glass. When his father died in 1380, Charles was only 11. Too young for grief to make full sense, too old to be shielded from it. The crown was waiting. The crown was always waiting. And so the boy, with his soft voice and steady gaze, was lifted high, robed in gold, and called king. But he was still just a child already fading into glass. Morning in the royal apartments arrived slowly, as though the sun itself must bow before entering. First came the hush of pale light creeping through mullioned windows, touching the tapestries with timid fingers. Then the faint rustle of attendants moving like ghosts, their slippers whisper soft upon the rush-strewn floors. And at last, when candles had been trimmed and a single fire coaxed into a docile glow, King Charles would stir. He rose reluctantly, as if waking meant stepping into a world too solid, too heavy. Silken bed curtains sighed as they were drawn aside. A physician felt for a pulse that beat steady yet fragile, as though every throb were questioning its own right to continue. Robes of velvet, the color of dusk, were draped over his shoulders, but Charles scarcely seemed to feel their weight. He moved with measured care, as though frightened the fabric might bruise him. Each morning began with ritual. A goblet of warm water infused with honey and crushed violets was offered to soothe the king's nerves. He sipped slowly, glass trembling between his fingers, eyes fixed on the ripples, watching them settle until the surface fell flawless, mirror still. Only then would he breathe a little easier. The chambers were kept dim. Heavy shutters narrowed the daylight to gentle ribbons, lest a sudden brightness shatter the quiet. Mirrors, wherever possible, were veiled in pale linen. Servants said their king disliked the way reflections multiplied the world, crowding him with too many versions of himself. Sometimes, passing an uncovered silver platter, he would flinch, touching chest and limbs to be certain they remained whole. Breakfast was taken in silence, soft bread soaked in milk, pears steamed until they nearly dissolved, broth strained clear of every coarse fragment. No knives were placed before him. Blades, the court learned, filled the king with an unnamed dread. Sharp metal felt like a promise of breaking. And so his food arrived cut small, gentle upon the tongue, requiring almost no effort to swallow. Afterward came the litany of governance. Yet even council meetings were hushed performances, voices low, movements slow. Courtiers bowed deeper, their gestures fluid, rehearsed, like dancers trained never to brush against forbidden glass. Ministers spoke in calm tones, presenting documents on parchment soft as moth wings, quills scratched so lightly they might have been writing upon mist. When debate grew lively, Charles would raise a gloved hand, silk against silk, and the chamber would still, fear and reverence braided together in quiet obedience. Sometimes, in the middle of a petition, the king's attention drifted. His gaze would slide toward the tall windows as if listening to a distant melody carried by winter air. If a servant coughed or a chair creaked, he startled. A flush of worry crossed his face, as though vibrations alone might splinter him. The courtiers began to move with exaggerated gentleness, pages turning like falling feathers, doors closing with the sigh of sleep. Midday found Charles walking narrow galleries lined with tapestries. A favorite showed St. Louis beneath a starlit sky. The king traced the stitched constellations with hesitant fingertips, assuring himself that cloth could not crack. Sometimes he paused before a tapestry of a hunt, and in the woven stag's wild eye he seemed to recognize his own haunted stillness. He would murmur a prayer no one could quite catch, then continue, step after deliberate step, footfalls barely audible on polished wood. At vespers, candles filled the chapel, hundreds of tiny suns flickering in amber gloom. Their flames calmed him. He loved the way light quivered yet endured, never spilling wax in panic, never scattering into shards. Chaplains chanted softly, incense rose in slow spirals, catching moonbeams that slipped between stone arches. Charles knelt on embroidered cushions, hands nestled within sleeves, and begged heaven for resilience no mortal physic seemed able to grant. Evening meals unfolded beneath vaults painted blue as midnight. Musicians plucked lutes in minor keys, careful not to strike discord. Dishes arrived lukewarm. Extremes of heat or cold startled the king. So cooks learned the art of temperate flavors. Stewed apples fragrant with lavender. Pigeons simmered in almond milk, custards spiced with a whisper of cinnamon. Servants carried platters as though they held delicate reliquaries. One tremor might scatter porcelain dreams across the floor. After supper, a reader recited stories, old romances softened by time. Charles' favored tales where knights discovered fragile relics and bore them safely home. Sometimes he asked the reader to pause, staring into the hearth, seeing castles of ember and ash. Those nearby swore they heard him wonder aloud, barely breathing the words, "Will they carry me so carefully when I am gone?" Before bed, he walked alone, save for one silent page, through a curtained loggia that overlooked the moonlit gardens. Roses slept under frost, fountains stilled in crystal hush. He touched the stone balustrade as if greeting an equal, cool and unyielding. Then, turning inward, he traced each step back to his chambers, counting under his breath. The number varied nightly. What mattered was rhythm, predictability, an assurance that nothing cracked beneath him. At last the bed. Enormous, canopied, draped in layers upon layers of gauze. Attendants warmed the linens with copper pans of glowing coal, then withdrew, leaving only a trusted valet who dimmed every lamp save one taper. Charles slipped between sheets, as carefully as parchment sliding into a codex. Arms crossed, he listened to his own heartbeat, a slow drum in a hall of echoes, and waited for it to lull him. Sometimes he whispered the names of saints believed to guard glass blowers, as though their blessings might extend to flesh. When the taper guttered, darkness folded over him like velvet. And in that darkness, a single thought rang soft and constant. Do not move too quickly. Do not breathe too deeply, for I am fragile and the night is long. Thus passed each day. A choreography of caution, a palace tuned to the brittle music of fear. Silence became the court's greatest etiquette. Gentleness, its gravest law, and everywhere, behind curtains, beneath whispers, lay the shimmering dread that one false step, one careless laugh, might break a king the way frost breaks a fallen leaf. Night in the royal palace was never fully dark. Even when every torch was doused and every shutter drawn, a thin silver glow seeped through cracks in the stone, moonlight too slender to warm, yet bright enough to stir uneasy thoughts. It found the king as he slept, tracing the pale outline of his cheek, resting upon eyelids that fluttered like moth wings against a window. The glass dreams. It began with a single dream, so fragile it might have been nothing more than a sigh. Charles stood alone in a vaulted hall of mirrors. Each pane reflected him not once, but 100-fold, until the copies overlapped, faces merging, crowns melting into crowns, eerie and indistinct. He reached out, but his fingers never touched glass. Instead, the hall dissolved into a rain of crystal shards that tinkled as they fell, singing like distant bells before vanishing altogether. He woke without sound, heart thrumming, palms slick with fear. The dream returned the next night, and the next, each time more vivid. Sometimes the shards bled, sometimes the shards drowned him in their brightness. Always he emerged unbroken, yet terrified that the miracle would not hold. The raven in the garden. Soon omens crept in daylight, quiet as ivy climbing worn battlements. A raven, large, ragged, coal-black, appeared in the winter garden. 3 mornings in a row it perched upon the sundial and refused to fly, even when pages clapped their hands to drive it off. When at last it departed, a single onyx feather remained upon the stone. Charles ordered it preserved in a casket of cedar, yet he would not look at it. He insisted instead that it be sealed, buried beneath the chapel floor, to keep the darkness from singing. The silent bell. On a chill February dawn, the smallest bell of Notre Dame cracked without warning. No storm had come, no hand had struck it. Parisians whispered that metal cannot break unless heaven itself groans. When news reached the court, servants found the king standing by a window, staring at the pale sky as though listening for an echo only he could hear. He murmured, "Even bronze forgets its shape." Whispers in the tapestry hall. Courtiers spoke in corridors scented with beeswax and rosemary. Soft, urgent murmurs. He speaks to his own reflection. He asks musicians to play so softly they cannot be heard. Last night he swore the floor was tilting like glass upon a spindle. Voices carried through keyholes, fluttered beneath doors, pooled in shadowed corners. The king's pages, sworn to silence, traded fearful glances whenever their master paused mid-stride, tilting his head as though listening to half-remembered music. The clock that lost its heartbeat. In the antechamber outside the council room, an ornate brass clock kept the hours. One dawn, it simply stopped. The hands rested at the moment Charles had risen from sleep, as though the gears themselves deferred to the king's first breath of the day. He demanded the clock remain untouched, afraid the sound of winding would crack something essential. Days lengthened, nights stretched. Ministers learned to measure meetings by melting wax, not ticking wheels. Snow that fell like ash. Late that same winter, snow drifted across Paris in flakes so fine they resembled sifted flour. The city hushed, streets blanketed in white hush. In the palace courtyard, the flakes descended without haste, swirling gently yet never melting upon the king's cloak. "He does not melt them," someone whispered, "because he is colder than ice." Charles heard, and for a moment seemed to agree, pressing a palm against his chest, as though confirming a suspicion that no warmth pulsed there. Prophetic poetry. A blind minstrel arrived unbidden, claiming to carry words for the crown. Guided by a trembling squire, the old man spoke a single verse before fainting from exhaustion. "Glass upon a thorn of thought shall shiver when the pale king's breath is caught." Charles ordered no punishment, no reward, only silence. The minstrel was given a warm bed, bread, and wine. By sunrise he had vanished, leaving only a bent reed pipe beside the hearth. The owl at the window. One moonless night, an owl alighted upon the king's chamber ledge, white as bone, eyes bright as embers. It hooted but once, low and mournful. Charles, half dreaming, believed he heard words in that call. "Fragile, fragile." The bird departed, yet feathers lingered, scattered like snowflakes on the sill. The king refused to have them touched. He watched them all night until dawn, warmth drew them into silent flight. Court reaction. Each omen tightened the court's breath. Ladies crossed themselves behind fans. Knights traced protective sigils upon sword pommels. Healers blended draughts of valerian, poppy, and chamomile, urging the king to drink, to sleep, to dream of nothing at all. But dreams, once invited, seldom surrender. Like patient ghosts, they waited until Charles's eyes closed, then unfurled their quiet dread once more. Closing whispers. And so the palace became a vessel of soft forebodings, a place where ravens, bells, feathers, and frost conspired in delicate chorus, where every creak of timber or flicker of candle flame seemed to spell a warning meant only for a monarch, balanced between flesh and fragile fantasy. Some nights, in those final breaths before sleep, Charles pressed both hands over his heart and whispered, hold together, as though the words themselves might fuse bone and spirit against the shattering future he felt rustling close, soft as wings, cold as snow, clear as glass kissed by moonlight. Along the draughty passages that looped behind the great chambers, those back corridors where tapestry linings hid cracks in the stone and servants' footfalls scarcely echoed, stories began to pool like rainwater in broken flagstones. The Queen's letter. They said Queen Isabeau kept a letter locked within an ivory coffer, its wax unbroken, yet its warning known. Beware the mirror that blinks. Some swore it came from a German astrologer who charted comets in red ink. Others whispered it had been smuggled from a Carthusian who had taken a vow of silence but not of ink. No one ever saw the parchment, yet every maid could recite its single sentence by heart, as if reading words etched on the inside of their eyelids. The blacksmith's debt. In the noisy suburb of Saint-Marceau, a blacksmith confessed, after too much cider, that he had once forged a silver fillet for the young Prince Charles, embedding flakes of ground quartz so fine you could not see them, only feel the chill. He claimed the royal treasurer never paid him, hence the crown itself was cursed with unpaid metal and might crack the mind of any head that wore it. By dawn, the blacksmith recanted, but the tale had already galloped through the marketplace, trailing sparks of gossip like iron struck at midnight. The glassblower's apprentice. An apprentice from the glassworks at Rouen arrived to present fragile beakers shaped as lilies. While waiting in an anteroom, he whispered to a footman, "Our master once shaped panes so thin they rang like chimes." He sold a set to the crown for the nursery of Prince Charles. One pane shattered in moonlight, without touch, without wind. When the footman asked how glass could break in silence, the apprentice only crossed himself and replied, "Because the moonlight sang too loudly." The monk beneath the stairs. In a forgotten stairwell beneath the palace library, a gray-robed monk was found copying verses not from scripture, but from an old Breton folk song about the Roi de Verre, the Glass King, who would reign until a crown of iron replaced his crown of fear. He pleaded that he merely chronicled legend, yet guards swore the ink on the page glimmered like crushed crystal, and every word ended in a jagged point. The monk vanished from his cell 2 nights later, leaving only dust that sparkled faintly when torches passed. Whispers of a bloodline, fault, physicians, unable to name the king's malady, turned to lineage. They traced murmured tales of Charles's grandmother, who in twilight years spoke cheerfully to empty chairs, of an uncle who feared sunlight would peel the skin from his bones. At supper tables laid for nobles, wine-flushed tongues muttered of La Folie de Valois, a hidden fracture within the royal blood, thin as hairline glass, widening generation by generation. Servants' superstitions. Kitchen girls spat twice behind the stove each time the king entered the great hall, once for mercy, once for mending. Stable boys wrapped horseshoes in linen before nailing them, so the clang would not echo up the cobbles and fracture royal nerves. Laundry maids refused to snap bedsheets in the courtyard. Instead, they shook them gently, as if waking a child from a troubled dream. When questioned, they simply answered, "Linen can be rewoven, glass cannot." The candlemaker's omen. A delivery of tallow tapers arrived one dawn smelling faintly of rose oil. The maker begged an audience and revealed that, while mixing wax, he had found a tiny glass tear embedded in the fat, clear, perfect, and impossibly cold. He took it for a sign that the candles must burn only low, lest a taller flame draw forth more tears. The steward paid double for silence, but words slipped out on the breath of a scullery boy who loved a maid who loved to talk. Echoes in the choir. In the royal chapel, choristers practicing Miserere insisted a 13th voice hovered above their harmony, thin, tremulous, brittle as splintered ice. They claimed it faltered whenever the word misericordia was sung, then shattered into a hush so sudden one could hear dust settle on the altar cloth. The choirmaster barred mention of it, yet the boys crossed themselves twice before each rehearsal, and kept shards of broken crystal beads in their pockets for protection. Thus, through vaulted halls and candlelit kitchens, in scriptoria and stables alike, the stories wound tighter, weaving an invisible net around the fragile monarch. Some tales contradicted, others chimed together like shards shaking in the same cup. But every rumor, every secret, no matter how small, carried the same refrain. Something delicate is breaking at the very heart of France, and we are powerless to mend it. And in that hush between telling and believing, the palace listened, holding its breath, lest a single careless word or a single careless touch shatter the king, and with him, the kingdom itself. At first the change was almost imperceptible, like dawn stealing across frosted fields. A sideways glance caught too long in thought, a breath held just a beat beyond comfort, the faintest hesitation before his hand found the arm of a chair. Yet within the hush-woven palace, where every twitch echoed like iron in a bell tower, those subtleties rang louder than any trumpet. Have a tremor beneath the silk one autumn evening, while the king listened to a madrigal played on a single viol, the bow glided over a note, so slender it vanished into silence. At that moment a quiver passed through Charles's fingers. It was slight, no more than a shiver in candle flame, but the page who knelt at his side saw it, and the court physician saw the page see it, and thus the rumor began. The king's hands had lost their stillness. When asked, Charles insisted he was merely cold. 20 braziers were lit, yet the tremor returned the next night, and the next, blooming like frost on glass. The invisible weight. Soon he spoke of a heaviness about his chest. Not pain exactly, but pressure. Gentle yet relentless, as though unseen palms pressed inward to prevent him from expanding too fiercely. He begged his valet to loosen every clasp, every ribbon, every loop of thread. Yet once freed, he asked that the cloth be drawn close again, fearing a sudden chill might crack him from within. The court tailor learned to fashion garments of softest Florentine wool, cut wide across the ribs, stitched with near-invisible cords so they might be tightened or slackened at a whispered command. Mirrors, veiled forever. Mirrors, once merely disquieting, became objects of terror. Crossing a gallery lined with gilt Venetian glass, Charles froze mid-stride, gaze transfixed not by his face, but by the tremble of reflected torchlight flickering across the panes. He saw, he swore he saw, web-thin fractures spreading from his own image, fine as spider silk, radiating like frost across a pond. With a broken cry, he staggered back, arms wrapped round his torso, certain he heard the faint music of cracking crystal. From that night, every looking-glass was draped in violet cloth. Pitchers and goblets of polished metal were banished. Even polished floors were dulled with lengths of woven rush to hush their shine. No footstep uncounted, walking became ritual-tight choreography. Each corridor was measured, 7 steps from bed to door, 9 from door to hearth, 12 from hearth to cushioned stool. The king mouthed the numbers under his breath, a litany of caution. If a courtier addressed him mid-stride, he paused, finished the count, then answered, voice low, strained, grateful that the pattern had not been broken. When an inattentive page once crossed his path unannounced, Charles startled, stumbled, and pressed both palms against the wall as though pinning himself in place while the world steadied. The page was reassigned to the stables, where shattering was less feared. The shard song. Soon ears joined eyes in their betrayal. At dusk, a servant dropped a porcelain basin in a distant scullery. The crash raced through corridors like thunder. Yet to Charles it arrived changed. Higher, purer, almost musical. He described it later as bells wrought of ice. Thereafter, ordinary noises, the clink of cutlery, the crack of a log in the hearth, the whisper of fresh parchment torn from a quire, rang to him like the collision of glass against glass. He flinched with each note, shoulders tightening, breath thinning, as though the palace itself were a vast crystal cathedral, every sound another hammer blow to its brittle walls. Sleepless under moonlight night brought no respite. Dreams returned, sharper, clearer. He felt them before sleeping, a pulse at the base of the skull, a hush pooling behind his eyes. Sometimes he called attendants at midnight, begging they douse even the single taper left to ward demons, claiming its tiny flame shone through his skin, illuminating bones as fragile as spun sugar. Other times he insisted all windows be unlatched, no matter the frost, for he could not breathe within walls that pressed so near his brittle frame. Wind coursed through damask drapes, frost feathered the sill, still his brow remained damp with unease. Physicians and phantoms healers arrived with leech and lancet, herbal draught and holy relic. One prescribed ground pearl mixed with milk to strengthen inner hardness. Another bled him from the forearm, citing humors congealed like molten glass. Charles fainted at the first crimson bead, convinced the liquid shone too bright like ruby-stained crystal. A Dominican friar offered prayers at the foot of the bed. The king thanked him but asked that the rosary beads be wrapped in linen, lest their gloss remind him of mirrors. No cure eased the tremor. No vigil calmed the shard song. Each dawn found the monarch thinner, voice softer, gaze slipping sideways as though searching for cracks that only he could see. The fracture of confidence. And so an invisible fissure split the court. Some clung to loyalty, soothing their sovereign with velvet words and slower steps. Others whispered of abdication, of regency, of cousins eager for power. In private chambers they rehearsed arguments, spoken gently, respectfully, as though the very air could shatter. Letters flew to Bourges, to Burgundy, to Avignon, carried by riders instructed to gallop only under moonless skies when hoofbeats might sound dull. For while the king's mind frayed, kingdoms beyond the walls listened with bright, unblinking eyes. Candle at the core. One bleak Advent evening during Compline, Charles approached the chapel altar alone. He reached toward the tall glass vessel that sheltered the sanctuary flame, fingertips hovering just shy of its smooth surface. Witnesses swore they saw a tear trace his cheek, though the man himself scarcely wept. He breathed a single plea, "Let me not break," then turned away before touch could tempt fate. The next day he ordered the vessel replaced with an iron lantern, soot, black, and dull, quiet as falling dust. Thus the symptoms grew. Shaking hands, measured steps, glass-borne echoes, sleepless dread. They gathered like dust in crevices of carved wood, silent yet impossible to brush away. And all the while, beneath every tremor and hush, lay the deeper fracture. A monarch's certainty that flesh, spirit, and crown were not forged of sturdy bone or iron will, but of something bright, delicate, and doomed to shatter beneath the simplest weight of living. And in the corridors beyond his guarded chamber, candles guttered, shadows bent, and those who loved him prayed, not for victory or glory, but for softness, that every hour might land upon the king as gently as snow upon still water, leaving neither crack nor ripple in its wake. Within the echoing labyrinth of the Louvre, the first rule became silence. Not the reverent hush of chapel aisles, but a stifled quiet born of dread. The sound of courtiers, thus holding their breath, did brush the monarch and break him. The council in gentle murmur. Day after day, the king's council gathered beneath rafters, dark with age. Long trestle tables lay strewn with treaties and wax seals, yet voices seldom rose above a murmur. The chancellor, Jean de Montaigne, mastered the art of speaking in half phrases, letting meaning drift like incense rather than strike like hammer on anvil. Questions of war, coin, and law were floated, never flung, across the room, while all eyes studied Charles for the slightest tremor. If his lashes fluttered, debate fell still. If his breath hitched, quills paused mid-stroke. No parchment was rolled too briskly. No chair dared scrape the tiles. The healer's procession. Physicians moved through corridors like penitents, carrying copper basins, sachets of asphodel, vials of pulverized oyster shell. Each remedy was presented with a bow, each rejected with a fragile smile. When their arts failed, mystics appeared, a Breton bone reader who laid tiny shards of lamb knuckle upon scarlet cloth, searching for patterns of mercy, a Moorish astronomer who charted conjunctions of Saturn and Mercury, insisting the king's humors were ruled by cold planets, a Provençal perfumer who brewed oil of orange blossom, promising its scent would thicken the air, cushioning every movement. None succeeded, yet none were scorned. Dismissal itself felt dangerous, an act too sudden for crystal ears. The Regency debate, spoken in lantern light. In deep alcoves, nobles of Valois bloodline whispered of a regent. Duke Louis of Orleans, Charles's own brother, paced marble floors, every spinning thought restrained to softness. He spoke of burden and duty, but even ambition bent its knee, shaping itself to gentleness. Opposite him, Duke John of Burgundy pressed a palm against cold stone, arguing that governance must not fracture with the king. Yet neither dared raise the matter before Charles directly. To utter the word abdicate was to imagine the sound of a splintering under weight of truth. The Queen's vigil. Isabeau of Bavaria, fierce once in brocade and emerald, now moved like a wraith in dove gray. She stationed herself at corridor crossings, intercepting any who walked too briskly, chiding them with a single uplifted finger. At night, she lingered outside the bedchamber, rosary muffled in gloved hands, reciting prayers in a whisper thin as candle smoke. Some claimed she consulted astrologers, others swore she forbade it, unwilling to know what fate might already be carved. Through every rumor, one image endured, the queen tracing invisible circles in the air as though drawing charms of padding around her fragile king. Servants in shadow. Below stairs, the great kitchens changed their rhythm. Cauldrons were lowered on pulleys wrapped in wool. Cleavers met cutting blocks cushioned with linen. Scullery maids rinsed plates in wooden tubs, damping every clink. A single dropped ladle earned not scolding, but a dozen terrified glances toward the ceiling beams, as if the monarch could feel vibrations through stone foundations. Chamberlains replaced iron door rings with braided silk cords, so panels might be eased, not slammed into place. It was said a sparrow once trapped in the dome of the great hall caused greater panic than any invading host. Hearts raced until the tiny wings were coaxed to a window and released into quiet dusk, sheathing steel. Even the garrison altered its creed. Blades were drawn only in the outer yards and only at dawn when the king still lay in restless sleep. Sparring partners wrapped hilts in cloth, shields were edged with leather to mute clatter. When a spear snapped during drill, the captain himself carried each splinter to the armory, fearful the crack might echo through tapestry-lined corridors like thunder across a lake of ice. Music tuned to murmuration. Musicians, once proud of flourishes that filled vaulted ceilings, retuned instruments to a gentler register. Harps replaced shawms, Viols played in modes soft as dusk. Court composer Guillaume Dufay arranged lullabies stitched with pauses long enough to let the very air rest. A wrong note risked more than embarrassment. It threatened to send ripples across the king's mind, and so rehearsals became prayers of perfect restraint. Flickering hope, a candle never quenched. Yet amid timorous days and tremulous nights, flickers of hope persisted. When the king managed to smile, thin, weary, but unshattered, servants exchanged glances bright as sunrise. When his hand rested steady upon the arm of a chair, counselors released breaths they did not know they held. From Rouen to Rheims, pilgrims lit votive candles, tiny sentinels of faith lined upon altars. Their flames, like the monarch himself, trembled yet endured. And so the Louvre lived in a strange half-light, caught between duty and dread, splendor and stillness. A palace of velvet steps, hushed decisions, muted trumpets. Every soul within its walls moved as if treading the surface of a frozen pond, wary of the faintest crack, listening for the sigh of concealed water. They carried on because courts must carry on, because parchment must be signed, because bread must be baked, because banners must yet fly above the Seine. But beneath each act beat a single unified prayer, voiceless, ceaseless, tender. May our king remain unbroken 1 hour more. And within that tender wish, the nation itself held together, fragile as a winter morning's frost, waiting, always waiting for the sound they feared most. The shatter of a rain no silence could mend. Winter folded over Paris like a great wool cloak, muffling clatter, muting color, pressing the kingdom into quiet. Within the palace, the same hush deepened, but here it was not the season's doing, it was the king's, curtains drawn. One dawn, when frost traced silver filigree upon every pane, Charles rose and ordered the shutters fastened, and the draperies tied shut with cords of dusk blue silk. He claimed the daylight felt hard, each ray a lance of crystal aimed at skin and soul alike. Servants obeyed. Candles were lit, small, steady flames that dared not flicker. Thus began a reign of half-light. Corridors glowed amber, rooms breathed in perpetual twilight, and the sun itself became rumor, spoken of but never seen. Rooms dark, steps bare, he grew restless in chambers too ornate, too furnished with brittle splendor, so the upholsterers carried out chairs gilded like sunrise, replacing them with benches of plain chestnut, softened by fawn-hide cushions. Tapestries depicting tournaments were unhooked, their clangor of color too boisterous. In their stead hung woven fields of pale wheat beneath muted skies. Across these gentled floors, Charles walked barefoot, said he must feel each plank, each knot of grain, to know the world remained whole beneath him. The hush of unshod steps spread through the staff. Clogs were banned, boots left at thresholds. Every heel learned to kiss the wood, not strike it. Meals untasted. Food arrived in bowls of dull pewter, broths thin to translucence. The king tasted little. He claimed scent alone nourished him, time drifting upward like memory, steam curling soft as parchment corners. More often the bowls cooled untouched, and pages carried them away with bowed heads, as though removing relics that had failed to work their cure. Physicians recorded his waist shrinking finger width by finger width. Seamstresses tethered new eyelets into his doublets, tightening them each fortnight, then each week. Words withheld. Speech, once quiet, became rarer still. At council he spoke in brief nods, eyelids lowered, voice scarcely above wind through keyholes. When the chancellor pressed for treaty opinions, Charles answered with single syllables, soften, delay, spare. If conversation drifted toward levies or sieges, a tremor crossed his lips, and he withdrew behind folded hands as one might close shutter against storm. In private he conversed chiefly with silence, listening to wax drip from candles, to his breath weave through ribs, to the faint tick of his own pulse. Letters unread, petitions piled upon a small oak trestle, seals unbroken. He would sit before them some evenings, fingertips grazing the parchment edges without lifting a single scroll, as though correspondence were shards waiting to cut. Eventually, the queen decreed summaries spoken aloud in the gentlest tones, yet even summaries dwindled. The king no longer asked for news beyond the palace walls. The world outside grew vague in his mind, like a map left too long in rain. Gardens gone to shadow, where once he had strolled among espaliered pear trees, Charles now regarded even open air with suspicion. A courtyard breeze might shift a cloak too quickly, might surprise the skin with sudden cold. So the gardens remained unseen, their pathways filling with leaves that no broom dared disturb for fear the scrape would echo. From high windows he watched branches sway against twilight clouds, and his eyes glimmered with longing laced to dread. For what is wind but an unseen hand, capable of breaking anything delicate that stands in its path? A palace of echoes. With each passing week, fewer servants were required. Fires needed less stoking, platters fewer washing. The echo of daily bustle faded until even whispers felt loud. Attendants began communicating in gestures, fingers touching brow for yes, palm to heart for no. And when absolutely necessary, they spoke as though offering lullabies to a child fever dreaming. The night of snow silence. One night snow fell so heavily that every cobble vanished beneath unbroken white. Even the city's ceaseless creak and murmur surrendered. Paris seemed carved from alabaster. Within his chamber, the king sat upon a low stool, candle guttering at his feet, listening to nothing. For snow is the softest of sounds, and in its hush he felt, for a heartbeat, almost safe. Yet safety kindled yearning. He turned to his valet and whispered, "If I stepped outside, would I leave a crack in the snow?" The valet, tears brightening lashes, knelt and promised no crack could mar such purity. Still, Charles stayed indoors. The window ritual. From that night forward, he performed a ritual at each twilight. 1. Approached the shutter. 2. Lay palm flat upon its wood, feeling grain aligned with pulse. 3. Breathe in. Count 4. Breathe out. Count 7. 4. Whisper. Hold. Only then could he turn away, assured the barrier held firm, keeping the sharpness of the outside world at bay. Slowly fading footprint. With curtains drawn and mirrors veiled, with speech swallowed and footsteps hushed, Charles seemed to thin, to pale, to translucence. Pages swore that, passing him in a candlelit hall, they could glimpse the flame orange soft through the silk of his sleeve, as though light had learned to flow inside him. He did not deny it. He merely smiled, a wan crescent, and murmured, "Glass remembers light." A kingdom in pause. Beyond the Louvre, seasons still turned. Wheat sprang green, rivers thawed, markets bustled once more. But within those walls, time slowed to the pace of melting wax. Clocks remained unwound, bells tolled softer, and courtiers measured hours by the drift of motes in sunbeams that never touched the king. All France waited, uncertain whether this hush was respite before recovery, or the soft settling of dust upon something broken beyond repair. And in the dim of each solitary evening, Charles VI withdrew a little farther, soul folding like parchment scorched too close to a flame, until he became not quite absence, not quite presence, but a fragile hush suspended between both, unwilling to test which would shatter first, the quiet or the king. Long before Charles drew his first breath, long before a crown glimmered above his fragile brow, words about a breakable king had drifted through France like pale feathers caught upon uncertain winds. Most lay buried in dust-cloaked libraries, their vellum curling at the corners, ink brown to shadows. Yet in this deepening hush, the past began to stir, as if sensing the hour for its long-kept warnings had finally arrived. The scroll in the abbey crypt south of Paris, in the quiet abbey of Saint-Marchand, monks catalogued a trove of forgotten scrolls. One winter's dusk, Brother Rémy unrolled a parchment so thin it quivered like a moth's wing. Painted upon it, in letters of faded lapis, was the legend of Le Roi de Verre, the glass king who would shine brighter than sapphire, yet fear the gentlest touch. The prophecy ended with a line scratched in charcoal, rougher than the rest. When the candle's heart turns to crystal, France shall tremble at its own reflection. Brother Rémy copied the passage onto fresh paper and dispatched it, sealed with black wax, to the queen. But the courier, crossing frozen fields, slipped on ice, shattering his lantern and snapping his horse's leg. Only scraps of the message reached the Louvre, smelling faintly of smoke and pine tar, their edges charred like burned petals. Carvings in the choir loft. In the royal chapel, renovation revealed oak beams older than memory. Carpenters scraping soot uncovered shallow carvings. An owl, wings half unfurled, a thorned rose, a crown resting upon what seemed to be a pane of glass. Beneath these emblems ran a single sentence cut in angular script. May he who is brittle rule no longer than the silent bell survives. The bell of the story, cracked months before, still hung mute in Notre Dame. When priests reported the finding, court chroniclers recorded in ink so pale it nearly vanished, as though afraid the very act of writing might give the omen weight enough to fracture stone. The lost letter of the star reader. A star reader from Padua, one Maestro Ruggero, had once written to Charles's grandfather, foretelling a descendant whose spirit is clear glass, whose fears are quicksilver. The letter vanished into Chancery archives, but rumor said a clerk rediscovered it amid moldering registers while searching for tax decrees. He carried it down corridors dim with torch smoke, but halted outside the council chamber, hearing, through the door's heavy planks, the hush inside. Something in that silence convinced him to fold the parchment shut and slide it into his own sleeve, vowing to speak of it to no one. Years later, he confessed on his deathbed, yet by then the paper had crumbled to transparent dust. The white owl returns. On the first night of Lent, the white owl, seen once at the king's window, returned, this time settling upon the frost-rimmed coping of the queen's oratory. It gave a single cry, low and hollow, before beating off into the snow-bright dark, leaving claw marks like tiny runes in the ice. Isabeau commanded the prints be traced onto parchment. When compared with diagrams in a tattered bestiary, they resembled an ancient sigil, meaning fragilitas, fragility. The queen ordered the parchment burned in a brazier of rosewood. She watched it curl and blacken, yet could not shake the scent of smoldering paper whenever she passed that corridor afterward. The pilgrim with the glass beads. At the very gate of the Louvre, a barefoot pilgrim appeared, clutching a rosary made of translucent beads that glimmered with a cold inner light. He claimed Saint Denis had bidden him deliver the strand to the king, so the beads might bear the breaking in his stead. Guards, uneasy, escorted him to a side hall where a clerk examined the beads. They were not glass at all, but rock crystal, clear, flawless, resonant when struck together. The pilgrim refused food and water, repeating only, "The crown is heavier than stone and softer than tears." By dawn he had slipped away, leaving the rosary coiled on the rushes like frozen dew. No one dared present it to Charles. Instead, it lay in a reliquary beneath layers of silk, humming with a chill no hearth fire could loosen. Whispered concordance. Scholars, friars, and alchemists met by candle end, piecing these fragments like shards of a broken window. A cracked bell that once marked mercy hours, carvings of owls and brittle crowns, letters inked upon whispers and erased by fear, crystalline beads and lanternless couriers. Each omen pointed to a single image, a monarch of glass, ruling only until the smallest sound, the faintest fault line, the gentlest night breeze should bring his reign to glittering ruin. But how to warn a man whose very ears could shatter? How to deliver prophecy when prophecy itself weighed too much? The king's alone knowledge. Charles, though insulated from direct report, seemed to sense these stirrings. He would pause mid-prayer, eyes distant, and murmur, "There are words behind the walls tonight." Or, waking at dawn, he'd ask if the owl had flown again, though no one had spoken of its return. Some nights he called for a scribe, dictated a single cryptic line, "When flame turns clear, remember me," then waved the baffled clerk away. The pages of these night notes grew in number, stacked like slivers of ice beside his bed, too chilling for any hand but his to touch. Hush before a breaking. Thus prophecy no longer haunted distant abbeys alone. It seeped through corridors, drifted across tapestries, nested within candle flames. Everyone felt it. A hush taut as spun glass, a question unvoiced. Which would arrive first, the final omen or the crack it foretold? And in that breathless waiting, the palace, the court, perhaps all France, stood poised between trembling hope and an inevitable shatter, listening for whatever thin music fate might strike from the fragile instrument of their king. Time in those dim corridors lost its ordinary gait. Days no longer marched from dawn to dusk. Instead they hovered, weightless, like dust motes wheeling in a single shaft of candle glow. The Louvre became less a palace than an hourglass laid upon its side, sand no longer falling, merely floating, uncertain which direction to choose. Clocks unwound. The great bronze clock in the council chamber, mute since the king forbade its winding, stood frozen at a perpetual twilight hour, both hands pointing vaguely west, as though searching for a sunset that never came. Smaller timepieces followed suit. Pocket sundials tucked into coffers, sand glasses turned once and then ignored. Bell towers rung only by guess. When courtiers spoke of meeting after tierce or before vespers, their phrases carried the softness of legend, for no one truly knew when prayers began or ended. It was said you might cross a gallery at noon and upon your return find dawn still fingering the windows. Stillness of the staff servants adapted quickest. They learned to measure labor by candle length, replace rushes when a taper burned a finger width, fetch water when the wick cut its own shadow in half. They stepped in rhythm with these small flames, and so their motions acquired a patient, ceremonial grace. A maid rinsing linen in lavender water became a kind of moving statue, arms dipping, lifting, never hurried. A groom brushing a dester in the stables counted strokes in silence, neither hastening nor lagging, until horse and man breathed as one hushed creature. The guards, whispers. Even the royal guard, sworn to readiness, found themselves lulled, Patrol routes shortened, then overlapped, until sentries shared the same stretch of corridor like twin shades pacing a dream road. Helmets were carried beneath arms, lest a clang wake echoes. Their watchword, vigilance, dwindled to a mouthing of shapes rather than a spoken sound, for the clatter of consonants felt too rash. Yet eyes remained keen. There was simply less of the world to look at, as though the palace itself had folded inward, rooms retreating behind rooms like nesting boxes. Candles as suns, embers as moons, with shutters barred and seasons muffled, light divided into two small kingdoms. Day was ruled by candles, stubby, humble monarchs hissing quietly upon every sill. Night belonged to embers, slow-breathing constellations buried in the heart of hearths. People drifted between these twin realms without clear border, speaking of earlier or later rather than morning or night. When fresh wax arrived from the chandlers, it was greeted like a shipment of gold. When ash was emptied from a grate, pages swore they tipped out handfuls of cooling stars. Paper-thin conversations, dialogue thin to paper whispers. In the library, scholars passed notes instead of words, scribbling queries about treaties or harvests upon scraps already crowded with candle grease and ink blot. In the kitchens, cooks gestured spices, thumb and forefinger pinch for salt, spiral of wrist for saffron, so the rattle of jars would not break the hush. Sometimes two friends would sit upon a bench beneath an unlit torch, exchanging entire memories with a glance and a tilted brow, leaving silence to bear their laughter. The king at the center. And at the still heart of this suspended hourglass sat Charles, motionless as a bead of resin trapped in amber. He slept at irregular intervals, drifting off mid-sentence, waking minutes or hours later to the same humble flame. Some evenings he would rise, cross to the shuttered window, press an ear against the wood, and listen, not for wind, but for the tick that no longer lived in any clock. When none came, he smiled a brittle, grateful smile, as if reprieved from some unseen judge. Outside, the pulse persists. Yet beyond the palace walls, the Seine continued to slip beneath its bridges. Merchants still haggled beneath awnings of soaked canvas. Roosters crowed regardless of human clocks. News from the frontiers rattled toward Paris on cartwheels and anxious hooves. But inside the Louvre, such messages landed upon a surface too calm to ripple. A courier might bring tidings of siege or treaty, only to find himself answering the softest question. How many petals has the spring almond? For the king wished to know gentle things, not the rough weight of armies. A hushed equilibrium. Thus palace and king entered a hush so deep it formed its own fragile balance. Too loud a sound and everything might crack. Too swift a movement, and hours might resume their fall bearing weight. Charles could no longer shoulder. And so everyone waited, breathing in time with candles, hearts ticking in the hollow where clocks once ruled, minds floating between moments like flakes of snow that refused to land. In that suspension, neither living quick nor dying sure, France held its breath with its monarch. A nation of glass nerves and silken footfalls, praying the delicate balance could last yet one more silent heartbeat. No one could later agree on the precise moment when finality settled over the palace. It came as softly as mist drifting down the Seine, and almost nothing that, once noticed, could never be unheard. A hush within the hush, a deeper stillness curling through corridors already lulled to whispers. Pages felt it first, a weight in the lungs when they climbed the servants' stair, a quiet tremor in candle flame that was not draught but omen, the quiet taper. In the king's bedchamber, a single taper burned both day and night, its glow small as a robin's egg. Physicians had begged to brighten the room, fearing the damp, but Charles refused. Too much light rattles the glass, he murmured, closing his eyes against an imagined glare. He asked instead for the wick to be trimmed every hour, so the flame would never leap, never hiss, only breathe, slow and even like as he tried to do. Visions of a younger dawn, sleep slid over him in silvery layers. When his eyes shut, the years unspooled backward, and he wandered halls no longer darkened. A boy in crimson hose chasing a wooden hoop across sunlit tiling, his mother's voice singing an old Bavarian cradle song, the soft shock of snowflakes caught on a child's eyelashes. He stirred, lips forming names long silent, Joanna, Louis, Jehan, and attendants hearing only faint syllables like answered each with a hush, as though respectful to ghosts newly arrived. A pulse of candle shadow nights blurred into one another. When the taper guttered too low, its shadow wavered upon ceiling beams, drawing delicate cracks of darkness above the king's bed. Charles watched them, certain he saw stars beyond, pinpoints through an invisible dome. He whispered, "Do you hear them ringing?" Valids, not knowing what sound he meant, leaned closer, but heard only faint breath. To Charles, however, every heartbeat in the room chimed like distant crystal bells, tolling an hour only he could count. The breath of flowers. At Queen Isabeau's command, lavender and sweet marjoram were strewn beneath the coverlet, their scent meant to soothe. Yet Charles asked to keep a single sprig of rosemary near his pillow. For memory, he said, fingers brushing the leaves as though testing their resilience. When a petal loosened and drifted onto the sheets, he regarded it with wonder, marveling that something so small could fall without shattering. "Teach me that," he breathed, and the petal, unruffled, simply lay where it had landed, the vigil of soft voices. Priests came 2 by 2, sandal steps muffled in wool wraps. They spoke psalms so gently the consonants seemed feathered. Charles echoed fragments, still waters, shadow of death, then paused, sensing how even holy words might fracture if carried too forcefully. So they prayed by rhythm rather than volume, letting syllables float like doves across the hush. The clock returns, unwound. One afternoon, as light slanted pewter gray between shutters, a steward carried in the small brass clock long silenced. He set it upon the bedside stool, unwound. Its face gleamed dully in candlelight. Charles studied its motionless hands and smiled. See, even iron remembers to be still. No one dared wind it. The clock kept perfect silence, marking the end by refusing to mark at all. Sighs of the tapestry. Across from the bed hung a new tapestry, woven in hushed tones. Pale stag at dusk beside a mirrored pond. Many nights earlier, the king had asked for a scene, still enough to hold. Now, in dwindling hours, he watched the stag's reflection ripple faintly in torch shadow. He whispered to it, "I shall step softly, friend." Some swore the woven stag bowed its antlered head, returning the promise. Dimming embers. On the eve of Candlemas, hearth embers crumbled inward, showing veins of ruby beneath ash. A valet moved to stir them, but Charles lifted 2 fragile fingers. "Let them sink," he said. And so the fire withdrew slowly, glowing deeper, lower, like a sunset folding into itself. With every fading spark, the silence warmed, becoming less a void than a velvet cradle. The last exchange. Toward dawn, Queen Isabeau entered alone. She knelt beside the bed, gloveless, and took his hand. A touch light as moon on water. "Charles, mon cœur," she whispered. His eyelids fluttered. Behind them, stars rearranged for the final time. "Glass can hold a flame," he murmured, barely sound, "if the flame is gentle." She leaned close, tears silent, and pressed his knuckles to her cheek. Neither spoke again. Stillness. Candles dwindled to blue beads. Breaths slowed to the faintest rustle. And at an hour no clock dared name, the king exhaled once, softly, a breath so fine one might mistake it for a sigh of the taper itself. Attendants waited, counting heartbeats they could not hear. When none returned, they bowed their heads, and the hush impossibly deepened. No crack split the silence. No pane shattered. In the end, glass held. Yet within that flawless stillness lay absence vast as night. And beyond the shuttered windows of the Louvre, the first birds of late winter began to sing, notes delicate, tentative, yet unbroken, as though testing the morning for fractures. The news passed through the Louvre like a candle's last whisper, one servant to another, one corridor to the next, until every soul within those walls stilled, as though the great palace itself had paused between heartbeats. The vigil of lilies. They dressed the king in linen soft as breath, looped a narrow sash of faded blue around his waist, and placed a single sprig of rosemary upon his chest, just where his own thin fingers had so oft rested. Lilies, white, unblemished, ringed the bed like quiet sentinels. Their scent rose gentle as snowfall, promising peace, not pageantry. In that hush, the queen returned, no diadem upon her brow, only a veil of black gauze. She knelt again as she had the night before, yet this time her tears left no mark upon the linen. Every petal caught each drop as though absorbing grief itself. Preparation in candle shadow. At matins, the priests entered, 2 by 2, their cassocks brushing rush-strewn floors with a sighing hush. They anointed the monarch's brow with oil of myrrh, signing a final benediction so lightly it seemed they feared to crease the pale skin beneath. Outside, heralds waited with trumpets muffled in dark cloth. No clarion call would pierce the dawn. Instead, each man lifted his instrument to lips and exhaled nothing, a gesture, not a sound. For the greatest honor they could pay the glass king was silence unbroken. The procession through whispering halls, 24 pallbearers, gloved in dove gray, raised the bier and moved with glacial care. At every doorway they paused, counting softly, 1, 2, 3, before crossing the threshold, lest a sudden jolt ripple through the fragile peace. Torches lined the route, but were dimmed to ember glow. Their flames bent gently, bowing to the passage of the dead. Tapestries once vivid now appeared washed with twilight hues, as though even dye respected mourning. Through the palace gate, when the iron gates groaned open, Paris greeted its lost king with streets swept clean as winter parchment. Snowflakes drifted, but slowly, thickly, as if the sky itself had learned to tread with caution. No bells rang. Notre Dame's cracked bronze heart lay silent, its silence louder than any peal. Instead, rows of citizens bowed their heads, hat brims dusted white, breaths pluming soft crescents in the air. They carried no torches, no banners, only small beeswax candles cupped in gloved hands. The flames quivered but did not leap, mirroring the steadiness that once defined their monarch's careful gait. Over the Seine, at the Pont au Change, ferrymen had drawn barges flank to flank, laying planks across them, fashioning a bridge of trembling wood. The cortege advanced, timbers creaking in low tones like viols tuned to morning key. Under the bridge flowed the river, dark glass beneath dark sky, catching torch glow and scattering it into smears of copper. Some swore they saw the bier's reflection shimmer, whole and unbroken, as though water itself refused to fracture his image. Arrival at Saint-Denis. The abbey loomed, towers veiled by snowfall, stained glass windows dim behind frost. Monks stood like chess pieces in two endless lines, cowls hiding every face but for lips murmuring psalms. Inside, incense spiraled upward, frankincense, cedar, a thread of winter rose, weaving slow ribbons through the nave until even the vaulted glooms smelt sweet with absolution. They laid the king upon a catafalque of ebony, its surface strewn with crystal beads from the pilgrim's rosary, each bead catching candlelight, casting tiny rainbows across the vault like sun through rain. The requiem of broken bells. Since no bell dared sound, the choir sang a miserere arranged for voices alone, alto and treble rising, folding, falling, each note held long enough to fade of its own accord. Listeners felt, rather than heard, the silence between tones, a silence as integral as music. During the offertory, a young chorister's voice cracked, a gentle fissure, brief and human. Yet in that moment, every heart tightened, fearing some echo of the king's dread. But the note softened, settled, healed itself in song, and when it did, a collective breath left every chest. Glass, this time, had not shattered. Interment in candle-blue dusk. At sunset, though shutters kept true sun away, candles were snuffed one by one, each gentle pinch sending a lace of smoke to coil upward like prayers unscrolling toward the rafters. The stone sarcophagus, carved weeks prior in secret, waited beneath a low arch. Its lid bore no jousting knight, no roaring lion, only a single etched pane of glass, intact, surrounded by lilies. 4 monks slid the king within, whispering the ancient formula, earth to earth, fragility to peace. The slab settled with a sigh more felt than heard. Then wax seals closed the join, their sheen mirroring the faint gleam of the etched glass. The cathedral's last light. When the final taper died, the abbey's interior darkened to velvet blue. In that near night, attendants noticed something curious. The carved glass on the lid seemed to glow softly, not with reflected light, but with memory, as though all the candles extinguished had left behind their gentlest radiance, seeping into stone the way warmth lingers in cooling hands. No one spoke of miracles, they merely watched, hearts hushed until the glow faded like breath on winter glass. Return of the world outside, snow eased. A faint wind coaxed bells in distant parishes to test their tongues. A single tentative note here, another there, until Paris exhaled a scattered tremolo of bronze, soft, uncertain, yet undeniably alive. Across the river, market women lit lanterns, bakers kindled ovens, children pressed hands to frosted panes to see dawn's first color. Life, gentle but persistent, resumed its slow, inevitable flow. Yet within Saint-Denis a hush remained, a memory of silence so profound it seemed carved into stone itself. And in that hush reposed a king who had feared breaking, kept now by walls thick as earth, watched over by candles that could no longer startle him, held forever intact within the quiet he had sought all his life. When the cortege had faded beyond the city gates and the last lily petal dropped from a windowsill, the Louvre settled into an after silence, a hush distinct from the careful quiet of the king's final years. This was the stillness that remains once a candle is snuffed. Calm, yes, yet edged with the faint smell of smoke and melted wax, reminding every breath that light had once lived here. Rooms sealed. The royal physicians locked the bedchamber first. Within, the single taper had burned down to a stub of ivory, its wick crowned by a tear of cold wax. The rosemary sprig lay brittle, its green faded to sage. Sheets, faintly creased by the shape they once cradled, were left untouched. Servants dared not smooth them, fearing to erase the last trace of a body that always tried so hard not to break the world around it. Outside the chamber door, a strip of white linen was nailed across the lintel, a silent decree that no footstep, no sigh should cross that threshold again. Dust gathered quickly, soft as snowfall, blurring footprints until the floor itself forgot where grief had walked, the throne and the crack of light. In the great hall, the throne stood vacant, its cushion of red damask catching a single shaft of sun that slipped between curtains not yet drawn. That blade of brightness felt almost cruel, like a shard of crystal driven into velvet. Courtiers, entering to discuss matters of state, kept to the shadowed edges, unwilling to let their cloaks sweep too near the beam, as though light itself might accuse them of living on. Over days the sun shifted, and the sliver of brilliance crept across the floor, inching toward the opposite wall. No one adjusted the draperies. They allowed the light to travel, a slow-moving crack of day, until at last it reached the cold flagstones and dissolved into evening. Then, in darkness, the throne looked softer, almost forgiving. The galleries of veiled mirrors. Elsewhere, swaths of violet cloth still hid every mirror. The queen ordered the veils remain until a coronation could give cause to lift them. Pages hurried through those corridors with heads bowed, hearing their own heartbeats echo off the covered glass. Sometimes a draught stirred a hanging cloth, revealing a glint of reflected candle, but only for a heartbeat before the fabric settled again, swallowing the light in purple folds. Echoes of a measured step. Servants noticed how their own footfalls sounded louder now. They tried to tread gently, but without the king's fragile presence guiding them, their rhythms returned unbidden. Heels clicked, doors latched, buckets clanged at wells. Each sudden sound felt like a transgression, yet it was also a relief, like lungs recalling how to fill fully after a long restraint. And so the Louvre seemed to breathe for the first time in years, unevenly, uncertainly, but undeniably alive. Letters unsealed, petitions left unopened for months were finally broken free of their wax. Scribes unfolded the crisp vellum and read aloud accounts of war, of famine, of new bridges spanning swollen rivers, of babies born to distant dukes. Each letter felt like a messenger from a world that had aged while the palace paused. Ink had faded on some, others bore stains where candle grease had long since cooled. Yet every sheet testified that time, unbidden, had continued its steady stride beyond those draped shutters. The chamber of notes. Beside the locked bedchamber, attendants discovered the stack of midnight dictations. Dozens of slips, each bearing the king's shaky script. When flame turns clear, remember me. Hold together. Glass remembers light. They placed them in a cedar coffer, uncertain whether to archive or burn them. In the end, they did neither. The slips remained on a windowsill, edges lifting in the draft, ink smelling faintly of lavender and fear. A kingdom looks inward. Beyond the palace, life resumed its louder tempo. Market cries, forge hammers, cathedral choirs echoing in unmuffled peal. But Parisians noticed small habits lingered. Voices dropped an octave in chapels, children stepped lightly across bridges, as though the city itself had learned a fragile courtesy it could not quite forget. And across France, word of the Glass King's passing fell like gentle rain on tilled earth. Some felt pity, some felt relief. Some merely wondered how a crown that delicate had lasted as long as it did. Yet all agreed on one thing. They would remember this reign not for battles or decrees, but for the hush it cast, the silence that taught an entire kingdom to measure its own strength by the softness of its tread. A breath held in stone, so the Louvre waited, rooms sealed, mirrors veiled, throne vacant, holding a breath of anticipation. Another monarch would come, trumpets would blare once more, mirrors would shine again. But for now, the palace rested in that rarest of intervals, the pause between sorrow and renewal, where every whisper lingers a heartbeat longer, and every footstep echoes inside the memory of glass. Night has settled once more above the old stone roofs of France. The bells are quiet now, the river glides beneath its arching bridges, and the moon, pale, watchful, leans over the shuttered windows of the Louvre, silvering every lintel and ledge with a hush of light. Within, the tapestries breathe their slow, dusty sighs. The veiled mirrors rest like dormant ponds. Candles gutter, whispering small farewells before yielding to the dark. And somewhere deep in the palace's silent heart, a bedchamber remains sealed, its single taper long extinguished, its sheets still holding the faint memory of a cautious, wavering crown. For all his fear of shattering, Charles VI did not break the world. Instead, he taught it gentleness, showed a kingdom how to soften footfall and temper voice, how to touch existence as though it too were spun of brittle wonder. And perhaps that is its own fragile kind of strength, to move so carefully that even grief arrives on tiptoe, to leave behind no clang of conquest, but a lingering echo of tenderness. So tonight, let us lay the story down beside us like a folded cloak. Feel the weight of it ease from your shoulders. The hush of dim corridors, the the slow dance of candle shadow, the breath of lilies and rosemary drifting through the winter air. Breathe in, hold gently, and breathe out, allowing the long centuries to settle like snow upon still water. Remember that every rain, no matter how grand or how fragile, finds its rest at last in silence. Remember that glass, though delicate, can cradle the glow of a flame long after the wick has gone dark. And remember, too, that you are here, warm, safe, listening, while the distant past drifts farther into dream, softened by time, until even its sharpest edges turn smooth beneath the velvet of sleep. Close your eyes if you haven't already. Let the world fade to quiet stucco grays and candlelit golds. Imagine the king's final chamber, sealed in peace, dust motes dancing like tiny constellations in the air. Imagine the softest bell note you've ever heard, its vibration lingering just long enough to say goodnight. The corridors grow dim behind us. The stars wheel slowly overhead, and somewhere beyond the reach of waking thought, the glass king at last lies unafraid, held forever intact by the silence he sought. May your own dreams be as gentle, your breaths as calm, your night as unbroken. Sleep well, traveler of stories. The candles are low, the palace is still, and all is tenderly, perfectly quiet.